Now it's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So once again, I'm going to take a little bit of a perspective that has to do with when we're entering the kind of large-scale emergency of the type that we're entering now, and that this symposium is about. What do we have when we enter it, and how does the way that we allocate the resources in this situation affect our future capabilities and capacities in society? So that's basically what interests me here. So let's see if this... Okay. So the most important thing in Torbjörn's book is the thing that's already been, I think, lifted a little bit, that this idea of convergence, that in practice, for a lot of different reasons, it will be that although we can have very different affinities regarding moral theories in the background when it comes down to practicalities, often there's a kind of a broad agreement on broad principles. Okay, so we had some disagreement before coffee regarding the concept of human dignity, for instance, but also the principles that you find, for instance, in the Swedish priority setting platform. I mean, there's some kind of principle of equal treatment, there's some principle of need, there's a principle of paying attention, that is how sick are people, and there's a principle of prognosis, how effective are the interventions that you're thinking about, and there is a principle of cost effectiveness, and basically these principles you find not only in Sweden but all over the place, in Europe for instance, but then they are implemented and interpreted in different ways. So the Norwegian case was lifted, for instance. Another case is the difference between how in Sweden the notion of prognosis is not sort of supposed to be allowed to include social utility, for instance, while in the UK application of it, for example, when NICE does its assessments of new drugs, they do include some of that in their health economical calculations that they do. So you can have these concepts, they are pretty broad, they are a bit vague, but these are sort of the operative principles that are used to rationalize or justify decisions that are made then in practice. So you're not really discussing utilitarianism when you're making these decisions in practice. For natural reasons, there would be no time to do that. So there's a lot of reasons behind that. So we discussed several ones already, and one has to do with legitimacy, that even if you like utilitarianism, for instance, everybody doesn't like utilitarianism, so you need to have some principle that can have a broad acceptance in society, for instance. There are a lot of transaction costs to a lot of considerations. To finding out someone's social utility in the emergency ward is just not... the transaction cost of that is totally unacceptable, of course. So, and there are lots of contextual values, that some considerations are very hard to implement in a way that would be consistent with principles of rule of law, for instance, and things like that. So a number of things that in practice then limits what we actually can use, what kind of principles we can use. And I will present a little bit a continuation of this train of thought, because my train of thought has also gone in the same direction, but regarding some other things. So this was really... Thank you. Right, so there's fundamental differences between the basic principle and the operative principles. And the operative principles, they are sort of used in a very thick kind of concepts with a lot of these considerations in. And one of the examples of that is, for example, the way that you deal out the resources in a state budget, for instance, or a regional budget or a healthcare budget. Another one is that you have these institutions that are just there. You can't change them when you make the resource allocation. And among these institutions will be, for example, professional ethoses in the healthcare professions that are not really on the table for decision. They are constraining your decisions when you make the decisions. And this may then shape the outcomes of how you then apply this operational principle much more than actually the background ethical theory does. So I don't know what... Okay. All right, thank you. Right, so when you have the large-scale, high-stake emergency that we're talking about now, then what happens then from the normal situation? That's another thing. And that's basically that it becomes much less, I think, important to focus on how we slice the pie of resources than we have, than to think about, okay, so the decisions we make on how to slice the pie, how will that affect the shape and size of the pie in the future? Because that has much more consequences for people that are affected. And basically, the better prepared we are, the more capacity we have, the less sharper the resource allocation problems we will face when we're in the emergency. And then I totally agree. And in some emergencies, we will eat up whatever capacities we have, and we will face these dire questions that we talked about before. Yes. So the first example that I have is the idea that we actually published a paper on recently, me and Erik Malmqvist and Davide Fugmagalli. It's about the thing that because you allocate, when you make these decisions of allocating resources, you never do them all things considered. You're doing it within a fiscal year or something like that. So you're handed a small pie of resources, you divide that up, then you enter the next fiscal year, you get a new pile of resources, you divide that up, and that goes on and goes on and goes on and goes on. And the point is then that the way you divide up your pie of resources at time 1 can affect the size and shape of the pie of resources that you have to allocate in the next round or sometime in the future. And the most obvious example of this is not negative dynamics, but positive ones. So if you have a really effective vaccination programs, you will get less burden of disease in the future, so you can produce more value with the capacity that you have in the health system than otherwise. But there is also the negative dynamics. So if you start to prioritize really ineffective medical measures, for instance, you will have more burdens of disease in the future to produce value. So you can produce less value with the resources you have. But there's also a number of other things that could play into that. And one thing that I've been working a little bit is, for example, the phenomenon of antibiotic resistance and the way we prioritize drugs. So one of the things that drive antibiotic resistance are the environmental dimension of drug production. So when drugs are produced, there is unfortunately emitted a lot of pharmaceutical pollution. Among these things, antibiotic products that drive antibiotic resistance. And antibiotic resistance undermines systematically the future effectiveness of healthcare. So if we don't pay attention to that dimension, and drug suppliers then who can sell their product cheaper because they're not minding about the pollution, they are prioritized in our system because of cost effectiveness, because the drugs are used as well as the other one. Then we are systematically contributing to something that undermines the effectiveness of the health system in the future. So that's one. Another aspect is vulnerable supply routes. So sometimes it's often cheaper to buy things where you have a very cheap supply route, but that's very vulnerable to disturbance. So you have a less certain supply of drugs, for instance. There's a number of other instances of these things. And the remedy here that we propose is to have some kind of sustainability principles that tell us to also have some kind of consideration of this future state that you are affecting. And I think this is important because this affects capacity to deal with things like, for example, a large-scale pandemic. And you can discharge this idea of sustainability in a number of ways. You could have it as a factor to weigh against, for example, need and prognosis, but you could also have it as kind of a savings principle in the budgetary fiscal consideration. You always set some resources aside for this future consideration that you do. That's not done in the present systems as far as I know. So that's one of the points that we have. So, yes. The other example is, I tried to find a word for it. This we have not published on, but I think it's a familiar idea. This is the way we organize the health system affects how vulnerable the system is to disturbances, basically. So the initial system's vulnerability is really important to consider when we, so we have a lot of institutional arrangements and organizational norms, I think, in a lot of countries that shape our health systems in various ways. Could be norms about, fiscal responsibility, could be norms about how to organize employment, it could be norms about different kinds of things, but also norms that comes from within the system, for example, these health professional ethos norms. And these things can then make the system more vulnerable. So for example, if you have some kind of employment organization that's very cheap from an employer situation, but makes it the case that when we enter something like a pandemic, we have less access to competent staff. Then we have increased the system's vulnerability, for instance. And I think these kinds of things can then be much more important than these considerations about the need prognosis pattern in a particular round of resource allocation. So the remedy here then is to have some kind of more consideration to primary prevention, especially on the social level then. And basically say that something like, if you have a way of allocating the resources that make the capacities decreased initial system vulnerability, that's worth an extra price to pay. So that's sort of a utility that's lost in the systems that we have now to a greater extent. It's not systematically counted. And that loss, so what you gain is not only that you gain what you can get from the capacity when you use it, it's also the value of being responsible and being prepared for these kinds of eventualities. So the negative side is that if you don't produce these capacities, then you're reckless in a way that's irresponsible. So that's another moral consideration that could enter here. So I think that this is a dimension of the resource allocation issues that is too easily lost when we consider a pandemic this. We're too easily caught up in the ICU dilemma and the triage dilemma, and I think that these considerations are actually the more important resource allocation issues to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this succinct. We actually have some time for questions. So let me ask you a quick question. So you're talking about basic and operational principles, BP and OP, as you call them. Now, often, and I think in some of the discussion that Torbjörn and Kasia and Peter had, one wonders the support they're trying to get for utilitarianists. They look at real cases where you're talking about operational principles. Yeah. But do you see a kind of utilitarian principle being acted there, or is it rather just some kind of limited kind of principle of beneficence that we should actually take into account people's well-being, which everyone will agree on?
Yes, I think so. So you can't use utilitarianism in the ICU, of course. It's not a practical decision principle. Is that what you can do is that you argue what sort of decision principles that you. So decision principle has to be sort of straightforward, have to be broadly acceptable, and they have to be not take too much time to discharge, basically. So I think that then they can contain some elements of judging the consequences. So for example, in the ICU you can when you take the clinical status of a patient, you of course also form an opinion. Okay, so what's the chance for this patient if you have the ventilator on, for instance, and you can compare that to other patients, and that's sort of part of the ordinary clinic, and that is some kind. I'm not saying it's a bit of consequentialism in there. I'm not even sure it's utilitarianism, but it doesn't really mean that you apply utilitarianism. I think it's the really valuable point in Torbjörn's book that you can have a lot of considerations converge, because a lot of the things that you find in the basic theories, you don't have time to do them. And there is no practical way of doing them as decision principles in a good way anyway. And there's this risk of abuse that came up with the sterilization policy question, for instance.
So what role do you see any kind of utilitarian principle playing in medical ethics then?
None at all. As a far-away background theory, but as Torbjörn mentioned, then you will have to accept huge portions of uncertainty about what is actually the best thing. And maybe you should also include the normative uncertainty on whether this kind of utilitarianism is the better rather than that kind, and things like that.
So then I see a big disagreement here, because I think both Kasia, Torbjörn, and Peter, they think that the utilitarian principle is a very important basic principle that even at least we maybe can only apply it in the cold hour when we sit and think out, but you seem to be very skeptical.
Well, what we think out in the cool hour will not be a utilitarian principle. We might use a utilitarian principle when we think in a cool hour, but what we present to the actual decision makers out there will not be
But
that.
you think it's useful in the cool hour?
Yeah, sure.
Have you used it in a cool hour to come up with these principles?
Yes.
Okay, and that's the only principle you used?
Yes, but as Sidgwick, I'm a bit reluctant to admit that, because it might spread the pest.
So it's a kind of governmental utilitarianism here that you're hiding at. Well, because as Peter showed also, it seems at least in court cases the principle of dignity comes up directly, although as you put it's pretty vague.
Yes.
So there seems to be used not only as a kind of a basic principle, but also as a decision procedure.
I think the standing of the principle of human dignity in the European scene has to do with the standing it has in the law. Basically, it has to do with that. So the main standing of that principle is in the law. And it's about two things. Basically, it's some kind of non-instrumentality principle that you talked about, but also this kind of equal consideration thing. And I totally agree with Peter that the equal consideration part is perfectly compatible with the utilitarian way of thinking about these trade-offs. So as long as you take everyone's interest into account in the same way, basically.
We have some time, actually, if there's any question out here in the audience. I might be violating the rules I've instructed to follow, but if there is a question. If not, then we thank you for this talk, and there will be more discussion.
Yep,
and
thank you.
Join me in thanking now.